Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
It is Sunday night, not Tuesday, but we'll do the time warp. It's just a jump to the left and redo Tuesday's show. There was a tech issue. You only program like 30, 60, 90, 120 minutes into the blog talk schedule thing, and for some reason you only got 12 minutes on Tuesday, but that was the best 12-minute rant I've ever done about any author's comprehensive research and how it helped me with my historical writing, especially with the study of the President McKinley assassination. So I'm not going to try to repeat that. I don't remember what I said anyways, plus the lost the archive. So it was a good one. I'll try to remember what I said and interjected while we discuss our guests' 3 books, and we might get into other one of his books. But I want to welcome Roger back to hopefully what's going to be a full 2-hour show. Hi, Roger Pickенpaugh. How are you?
I am well, thank you.
Okay. We're doing fine for the first 3 minutes, but when we were getting started Tuesday night, you did bring up the airship sighting over Sistersville and in New Martinsville in 1897, and when we had Zelia Edgar and Steve Ward as guests, and they were saying, "Oh yeah, research that." There was that documented report, and it does show up in the Mothman prophecies. And when I went to the Butler, the Butler Paranormal Conference yesterday, the BORU, Butler Organization for Research of the Unexplained, they do mention in their handouts at the front door, the earliest recorded UFO sighting occurred April 23rd, 1897. Is reported in the Newcastle, Pennsylvania paper, and it was seen across Butler County. And there have also been reports in Lindora, Evans City, Zelienople, and other places there in western Pennsylvania. So you Roger, your comment that you made on Tuesday, just like one of those synchronicity things. You kind of walk into the conference yesterday, and they hand me the paper, and it's like, oh wow, there's the same thing Roger was talking about. So I'm just saying, more buttressing evidence for what happened, guys, over 120 some years ago.
Yeah, that was definitely the time period, and I think they continued for just a few years. I think by the time 1900 rolled around, those sightings had pretty much ended.
And they would pick up, and then you get the Mothman in there too, in the late 1960s, and we'll be covering that later this summer. But it's just part of our local history. If the audience hasn't figured out, we don't live all that far apart, but one of the statements I was making at the start of Tuesday's abbreviated show was that you do take some of these local stories, let's just say, River on a Rampage, where you are covering what eastern Ohio, West Virginia's northern panhandle, looking at the flooding event. But what you are really terrific at doing as an author is showing that there melting snow further to the northeast contributed to the flooding. And since the river is nearly 1,000 miles long, and after the flood would have gone through West Virginia and Ohio, it's still going to have an impact in Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, drain into the Mississippi. So there is a region-wide. It's not, you take on these local subjects, but there's also a region-wide implication too. And I think that's one of the really interesting aspects of your writing. I think it becomes more pronounced with the President McKinley assassination book as well. But let's maybe start off with River on a Rampage.
All right, that's what we tried to start last time.
Yeah, and so the New England had a lot of snow. We just kind of recap that, and we can look at how the Ohio River was impacted.
Okay, so you just want the general background of the flood?
With the
okay.
just heavy snows in New England and everything that kind of can be put into the perfect storm. And I think that was about where we ran out of time last week, or on Tuesday.
Right, and long before the phrase perfect storm came into vogue, that is how One representative of what was then called the National Weather Bureau described it because a number of factors fell into place to produce record flooding, as you say, from New England down to the upper Ohio Valley. And it started with heavy snowfalls that winter. And then the heavy snowfalls didn't melt because it was a particularly cold winter. And then, as you got toward middle March, this was followed by heavy rains that were held in place by high pressure over the Canadian Maritimes. So the rains themselves, of course, contributed to the flooding. But in addition, they melted the snow, and that just added to the mix, and it produced record flooding. It affected 17 states, Pennsylvania the hardest, and when it was all over, it left 100 people dead and damaged or destroyed in the neighborhood of 35,000 buildings.
As we go through your three books tonight, most of them fit into the last 200 years with the national road starting. Might be able to go a little earlier, but we will see that over about the last 200 years that many of the issues that Thomas Jefferson, et cetera, were dealing with, we're still dealing with the same situations today. And for example, with the flooding, you get a major city like Pittsburgh gets hammered with two rivers converging. Some of the devastation is actually pretty bad with the number of fires. I think a lot of people probably don't think of fires during flooding, but you're saying that happened.
Definitely, yeah. Mainly the result of natural gas explosions. In fact, one of those occurred very close to where you live. A couple of the deaths in Wheeling, West Virginia, were the result of an explosion and fire.
Okay, yeah, and there's also, in times of crisis, there is the inevitable price gouging. And the photos that you include in your book just do show serious devastation to our area, and there is, the price gouging was going on. One businessman said he was asking the asking price to remove his family from their home had been $150.
Yeah, there was a lot of that. Yeah, people with boats suddenly developed a profit motive. Although there were, of course, the vast majority that wasn't the case.
Yeah, that's the next sentence. At the other extreme and more common were reports of selfless heroes rescuing and caring for flood victims. But you see the same thing going on in today's world. I mean, it just you make an interesting point here.
Yeah, and that will probably always remain a constant in human behavior. You'll have people that want to help, and we hope that's always a majority. But you'll have a few that will take advantage too.
Okay, and one of the really don't know what the right word, being awestruck, a terrifying predicament was it in East Liverpool, the flood starts hammering that town at night. That must have been very disorienting for people without the extensive modern street lights that we have today. And you have rising water. What was the effect of the flood happening at night versus it in the daytime?
Well, as you say, you could not see your enemy very well, so it just added to the fear and the confusion. There were also cases. Well, let me back up a little bit. There had never been a flood this severe in the upper Ohio Valley, and while there were some reports that it was going to be worse, there were people that just couldn't believe that it was going to be as bad as it turned out to be. So I remember at least one story of a man who did go upstairs, and he'd had a little bit too much to drink, and he fell asleep in an upstairs bed believing he'd be perfectly safe, rolled over in the night, and his hand splashed with water that was filling up the bedroom, and he spent the rest of the flood standing up on his bed to survive.
Well, okay, and there were some eyewitnesses still alive that you were able to interview. Can you tell us a little bit about that process of finding some of those people, and they're correcting the record? This happened in 1936, not the 1937 flood.
Right. Yeah. I did the book about 20 years ago, but it was still 60 years after the fact. So I think the oldest person I interviewed had been about 30 when the flood hit, and the vast majority had been children. So a lot of my eyewitness accounts were written through the eyes of children, and I'm sure that that affected their memories somewhat.
I believe I don't think the book's behind me. There's that passage from The Body Understands the Score, where trauma like that, the memory of that traumatic event doesn't really change that much. For some reason, have a pretty accurate memory, and they aren't really embellishing it with all kinds of other things they add on later. So I'm sure that you got a accurate account of what it was really like going through that kind of terrifying experience through the eyes of a child.
Yeah, and really, the vast majority of people I interviewed go through the worst of it. In other words, they didn't, have a narrow escape with their lives or anything like that. They were chased upstairs. Many of them were rescued on boats, but they seemed to approach it really more as an adventure than anything else. The the more dramatic stories that I got came more often than not from newspapers rather than from my interview sources.
And you do have photos, say, from the 38th floor of the Gulf Building in Pittsburgh, as well as some Smith Ferry, which is kind of right there on the Pennsylvania-Ohio border, with homes surrounded with the flood. Probably gotta be, there it is. You have the kilns in photo of kilns from Wellsburg that look like they are submerged. That would probably be related to in industry. How long did it take for the waters to recede, do the cleanup? Were some of these bigger employers area ever able to open up, or how long did it take them to recover to resume business and get the employees back?
Well, I'm sure there were exceptions to this, but in general, based on my research, and my research after the flood was somewhat limited, but these big factories in the upper Ohio Valley, as soon as the water started to get down, and it goes down pretty quick, within a day or two after the crest, you're able to get back into buildings even in low-lying areas. And, of course, anybody who's lived through a flood will tell you the important thing is to chase that water out as quickly as you can before it has a chance to have the silt settle down, because that's what gives you real problems in cleanup following a flood. And, of course, these business owners knew that. They'd been flooded before, not to this extent, but it was not a total novelty to them. So they called the employees in as quickly as they can. And as I say, I'm sure there were exceptions. I'm not giving the whole story here. But they had those industries up and running relatively quickly, certainly within a week in most cases.
Oh, okay. Well, what was the legacy of this flood? We know there was, the following year there was like 3, and went down, the Wheeling Island and checked their flood memorial. And there's 3 the next year, like 2 in January, 1 in March, and that's, I think I mentioned something on Tuesday where, the Green River in Kentucky was flooded at about the same time. I don't know if the Green River couldn't flow into the Ohio River, and it just backed up throughout Kentucky. And Dr. Webb writes a little bit about the flooding that occurred around Indian Knoll as he was getting ready to do some excavation. So it's really interesting that what you wrote about for the 1936 flood. You can read just a little bit that Dr. Webb covered in his Indian Knoll. It shows some kind of ecosystem connection across the eastern part of the United States. But is there some kind of legacy from these the regular occurrence of flooding? We'd have the dams built, about 20 years later?
Well, you mean dams on the Ohio?
Yeah.
The original system of locks and dams was already in place. There have been two sets of locks and dams on the Ohio, and by 36 these were all there. 52 or 53 of them between Pittsburgh and Cairo. I know the Warwood Dam in Wheeling would have been Lock 13 on the system, because Lock 14 was in Marshall County where my mother grew up. And then the system that's in now was begun in the 1950s and is pretty close to being completed, but not quite. Now, the Army Corps of Engineers has told me, and they've really hammered home this point, that the dams on the river itself are not for flood control. They're purely to deepen the navigation channel. But what did help keep 36 from being worse were dams that dammed up creeks, especially the dams that were built as New Deal programs here in southeastern Ohio by Muskingum Watershed, for one. These grew out of the flood of 1913.
Okay.
So they kept 36 from being even worse. And, of course, since then, there have been other dams built for state parks and the like, and they'll help going forward.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating subject. I just going on out of your book, and when you go to put something like this together with the variety of photos, where are you obtaining this many photos from across the region? Are they just online, or you going to a lot of libraries?
No, none of this I got online. The ones in the Pittsburgh area, and you might notice that they have a particularly high quality. They're very sharp pictures. They came from the Pittsburgh office of the Army Corps of Engineers. And then as I worked my way south, it really varied. There were county historical societies that had photographs. There were individuals. WWVA Radio in Wheeling put out a souvenir flood edition a few weeks later, and it had some very sharp pictures, which the folks at the radio station were kind enough to let me use. So it's a variety of sources.
Okay. Well, with the writing I've been trying to do, these county historical societies and libraries really do have great resources. They are a wonderful way to find information that may not, most people may not think about, but there it is. You just need to ask. I find them gone out of their way to be helpful for some of the projects I've worked on.
The librarians are wonderful people, with very, very few exceptions. They live to help you with your research questions and with your digging, and virtually all of them. In fact, I've never found one that doesn't. They have the old newspapers on microfilm, and for something like this, of course, that was a priceless resource. The newspapers and my personal interviews made up more than 90% of the book.
Yeah, I I agree with you. I think that they may be a frequently overlooked resource, but once you get talking with them, they probably have a lot of the information that a writer needs to fill in the gaps of their project, or the photos. I find that they've been there to provide limitless support.
That's been my experience, definitely.
Yeah, I agree. So, okay, let's kind of maybe switch gears, almost literally, to your latest book, America's First Interstate, the National Road, 1806 to 1853. I was just on it today for a few miles, and we will get to looking at some of the mile markers too. Did look at the one in someone's yard across the street from the Greenwood Cemetery, but we'll get to that here shortly. But let's take a look at this infrastructure problem from 200 years ago. It's always in the news anymore. Was it like in January? There's that Pittsburgh Bridge collapse. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but you could see that one of the buses was in a ravine. And you always have states always trying to fix the potholes at this time of the year. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington were basically dealing with the same bridge issues and potholes and the types of wheels to be used on the Conestoga wagons. So Roger, so there's not, we do have a little bit mentioned in the Constitution about the infrastructure. Get post roads, needful buildings, whatever that means.
Yeah, that's in Article 1, Section 8 under the powers of Congress.
Yeah. It built docks and
docks and
magazines,
shipyards and forts and magazines, arsenals.
Yeah, that's it. But it really doesn't say a whole lot about road construction other than for to get mail from someplace to your house.
Yeah.
So there became a need to build a road to there was a need to transport whiskey. That George Washington trying to get some of his customers land along the Ohio River. But so what were some of the early reasons for building a road from the eastern states towards the western prairies?
Well, for George Washington, who had been west of the Alleghenies 6 times and realized the difficulties of getting over the mountains, he was really afraid that as settlers began to pour into the Ohio Valley and settle what would become Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, later Illinois, Indiana, that their transportation magnet would be the West, the Ohio River and the Mississippi River. And Louisiana at the time was controlled by Spain, and he was genuinely afraid that Western Americans might be tempted to give their loyalties to Spain simply because of trade. So he thought it was vitally important that a road be built to connect the eastern seaboard with the Ohio Valley. And he didn't live to see this put into legislation. But Thomas Jefferson, who disagreed with Washington on quite a bit politically, he agreed on this. And for Jefferson, it was even stronger because most of these western settlers, being farmers, were oriented more toward his Democratic Republican Party than they were the Federalists.
Okay, so Jefferson wanted to, okay, like you said, there was a little bit of a political angle for Jefferson, but it also a constitutional issue, and we would find that with Madison as well, where it's like, it's not really in the Constitution, but we can kind of make an exception to it. So you have a couple, what do you say, like strict constitutionalists making, what do you say, moderating their stances.
Well, you had that in Jefferson's case, and he definitely was the strict constructionist, but at the same time, he was a practical individual, and if he could see the benefit of a government project, he could overlook his scruples. He did it with the National Road. He also did it with the Louisiana Purchase, because the purchase of a tract of land, especially one that vast, is clearly not directly mentioned in the Constitution. Interestingly enough, it was Jefferson's 2 successors and political allies, Madison and Monroe, who vetoed bills to keep the road going and really slowed its progress quite a bit.
Okay, well, so there, if you look at a map, Route 40, it goes through our area, through Indiana. I think it goes to California now, but
it actually goes as far as Utah, and then it becomes part of Interstate, I believe it's 80, on to Sacramento.
Oh, okay. But before the National Road was built, or let's just say started, there was an idea that was kind of already underway, and that was the Zane Trace. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that was the brainchild of Ebenezer Zane, your fellow Wheeling resident. In 1796, he got a government contract's not quite the right word, but he got permission from the government to build a road from Wheeling to a point opposite Maysville, Kentucky on the Ohio River. He didn't get any money for building this road, but he was given a land grant where the road would cross the Muskingum, the Hocking, and the Scioto rivers, and of course that became prime real estate. That's where the cities of Zanesville, Lancaster, and Chillicothe grew up. Basically, all Zane and his work crew, which is largely members of his family, did was just cut a path through the wilderness, cut down trees, grubbed most of the stumps. When it was completed, it was just wide enough for horse and rider to get through. So they transported goods by pack mule trains. There would be a dozen or so mules connected together that would carry the goods. And as time went on, it was just ordinary citizens who ended up really turning it into a highway, cutting trees to widen it so it could accommodate wagon traffic. But yeah, I would say the Trace was the first major road building project in American history, although by today's standards it doesn't appear very ambitious.
But okay, the beginning supposed to start in Cumberland, then you get other states saying, we want to start in Virginia and Pennsylvania. So you had the typical, like, political wrangling about, we want to, it sounds like a good idea. We wanted, to go through, through our state. So what were all those issues and how they finally decide on, like Cumberland, Maryland as the starting point?
Yeah, that's interesting because originally Cumberland wasn't even in the mix. The proponents of this road realized that since it was going to go to the banks of the Ohio somewhere, it couldn't really start any further north than Philadelphia as a practical matter. And Washington, D.C. would be about as far south as it would be feasible to start. And, of course, you had Baltimore contesting in between. So how it ended up with Cumberland, roads had already been constructed from both Baltimore and Washington to Cumberland. So starting there and just connecting with those roads that were already in place really gave the builders a head start. They were 100 or 200 miles already to the west if they began right there.
Okay. And the government needs to hire contractors to build it. So you bring up there were 8 sections, and there's bids on those going through Maryland, Pennsylvania, and further west. How are those contracts handled?
Well, first of all, the man who was named superintendent of the road was one David Shriver, who did have some experience in road building, and they paid him $1,800 a year to supervise the project from Cumberland to the Ohio River. That's as far as the original legislation was going to take it. And he was required to hire contractors on a bidding system. They would put in bids for a certain section of the road, usually somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 miles. And by and large, the low bidder would be awarded the contract. But this led to a lot of problems. Some of these contractors were outstanding, others not so much. There were some that would, of course, they had to hire work crews, and a lot of them ran out of money before the project was finished. One of them simply disappeared for about 3 months. They didn't always approve of Shriver's regulations. In fact, one threatened to drag him off his horse and beat him to death. So it wasn't really a good situation, but that's how the road got built.
Okay, and what was the McAdams design?
Well, that didn't come. The McAdams system did not come into play until 1825 when they started building the road through Ohio. Although what was done before was very similar. The main difference was the road, as it was built from Cumberland to Wheeling, had a slight crown to it. It was believed that that would help with drainage. But McAdam, the Scotsman who came up with this method and what it was generally accepted by the mid-1820s, he believed the road should be perfectly flat and then layers of cut stone applied, sometimes 2, more often 3, and then tamped down with rollers pulled by oxen. And this, he believed, would cause the stone more or less to adhere to each other like a jigsaw puzzle, and that would provide a smooth surface that, in effect, would drain itself.
Okay. And it is noted in Colonel Norris's notes about the road. It was like an Adena, prehistoric native road being built towards South Charleston, West Virginia, and it almost had the same design. I thought that was interesting that his 1884, writings on that road are very similar to the designs that you're talking about 1800 years later. Really, I just like how the Native Americans had the same design.
Yeah, they figured things out very early on.
Yeah.
And really, this the gravel road system stayed in effect until the early 20th century, when the automobile became more prevalent, and it became more practical to produce paving material such as cement and later asphalt.
So, you did mention that road's going to go the Ohio River. There are obviously other rivers that are between the Ohio and Cumberland. So you have to somehow get across the river. So there were a number of bridges built, and always, I think a lot of people have an interest in bridge architecture. You go into a lot of detail about the Casselman Bridge. What was the evolution of building that you uncovered while writing your book?
Well, I'll be honest. I am not an authority on the history or evolution of bridge building, but the Casselman Bridge, not too far west of Cumberland, I'm guessing here because it's been a while since I've been in that region, but maybe 40 or 50 miles to the west.
That's not about right.
That was the first large stream that the road had to cross, and that was really to be a test of whether or not this was going to be a modern thoroughfare or not, if they could get across that stream. And when the thing was completed, it was 354 feet long. It was at that time the largest stone arch bridge in the United States. And how well built was it? Well, it carried vehicular traffic, carried cars clear up until 1933, about 120 years after it was built, and it's still standing. If you're taking U.S. Route 40 through western Maryland, you can stop at the Casselman Bridge State Park. I believe they still let people walk across it, and it is an impressive sight, especially for a structure that was built more than 200 years ago.
Okay. And there's also the S bridges. What was their unique design?
Well, just that. They were shaped like a letter S, and there was a number of theories as to why they did that, anywhere from drunken engineers to stop runaway horses. But the simple fact is, at the time, because, bridge building, while it was developing as a science, it still was a far from perfect one, and it was simply easier to construct bridges that way in going from shore to shore along a large creek or a river.
Okay, I really like the photos you included of the bridges, and we also see what also get into some of the engineering achievements, like the Casselman River Bridge. There are also the Army Corps of Engineers had to come in, and it was that group who wanted to just keep the road going straight and then have roads go down to towns like Dayton. So that was kind of like a engineering mistake, where the highway was not going through the growing downtown area.
It was clearly a case of stubbornness. Now, the Army Corps of Engineers did not get involved until construction started through Ohio. Believe it or not, from Cumberland to Wheeling, the road was built under the auspices of the Treasury Department. But then when they started west of the Ohio River, the Army Corps of Engineers took over. That's when the McAdams system was introduced. And you're absolutely spot on. With military precision and military stubbornness, that road went absolutely due west. And people in places like Barnesville, Ohio, Newark, Ohio, Dayton, which even at the time was one of the larger cities in the state, they could not understand why that road could not be diverted just a little bit to go through their communities. And as a practical matter, they were right. But the Corps of Engineers, you could call it disciplined, you could call it stubborn, but they headed due west. anticipating Horace Greeley's advice.
Okay, so as I mentioned a little bit ago, as you travel west, you can still see today the mile markers that say how far you are from Cumberland and how far you are from the next town.
Right.
Basically the same concept is used on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, where you have a mile marker every mile.
Right. Yeah. And these were every mile. Of course, in those days, it took a lot longer to go a mile. And as you say, all of them at the crown had the distance to Cumberland, and then facing east and west were the distances to the next town, or maybe two, depending on which way you were going.
Okay, and there are there was two different types of mile markers. There, can you explain those? The ones made in a foundry and the others were stone?
Yeah, that's right. The ones east of the Ohio were made in a foundry. I believe it was in Brownsville, Pennsylvania. I'm not 100% sure on that. And then the ones through Ohio and beyond to the west were made out of concrete. And I'll put in a plug for what might be considered a competing book, but she did a good job. Cindy Gherkin put out a book just about the mile markers on the National Road, and she really did in-depth individual research tracking all that down.
What was her name again? Give her a...
Cindy Gherkin.
Okay. Yeah. So hopefully she's tuned in and get some book sales out of this.
So I'm going to
support.
pull out my bibliography here and just make sure I'm telling you right. Yes, Cindy Gherkin, Marking the Miles Along the National Road through Ohio. So it is just limited to the state of Ohio, but it's still an outstanding work.
Cool. Okay. I'll look for in a second. We keep moving along the road. We're seeing the evolution of the road, going from basically a footpath to traffic, two-way traffic. People need to have a place to stay overnight, and you discuss the development of inns along the way. What was it like staying at an inn along National Road in the 19th century?
For one thing, it was very, very unlikely you were going to get a private room. You were probably going to share a room with another traveler, and in some cases even a bed. The innkeepers were not that fastidious about changing linen, so it was very likely if you were sleeping on sheets, they were going to be sheets that one or more people had slept on evenings previous. At the other end of it, though, more positive end, you were going to be treated with great hospitality. These innkeepers went out of their way to make people feel welcome. You were going to receive a bounteous meal, high in quality and quantity, and you were going to be, at least when you're in the main hall of the inn, you were going to be kept very warm by a fireplace that could could hold several pounds of coal, huge fireplaces. Now that was for the travelers on stagecoaches. Now the people that piloted the Conestoga wagons, they were called wagoners back then, not teamsters. They stayed in what were called wagon houses, and with them you didn't get an individual room. There was just one big common room with a fireplace, and late in the evening they would spread out their feather ticks, the early day equivalent of sleeping bags, and all the wagoners would sleep together on the floor in the same room.
Okay, and there's we're back to a lot of whiskey.
Yeah. You could buy whiskey by the drink. Now again, with the wagon houses, you just paid a flat fee, and that got you 2 meals, a place to sleep on the floor, and all the whiskey you cared to drink.
A drink of choice.
Well, there wasn't there in the cities. You might have a wide variety of spirits and wines, but at the wagon houses, it was probably a choice of water or rotgut.
That's right. That's the reason why I like your historical writing so much. You just tell it like it is.
Well, I tried to.
Yeah. But then, that's why your books are so effective. You take us back to that time and help us to feel like we could walk into that situation and know how to conduct ourselves.
Well, I appreciate that. I hope I do that.
Now, you do. So you get the inns developing along National Road, and then there comes we get into the evolution of transportation along the road. And I thought it was really interesting to read about the small wheels and the wider wheels on the wagons. Can you explain that difference?
Well, this came into play when the states started taking over the road in the 1830s. The road had been built and maintained up to this time by appropriations by Congress, so it had been a taxpayer-funded project. Well, now the states were going to be responsible for maintaining the road, and they erected toll booths and charged tolls for various. Now they had a system of fees. I'm not describing this very well, but so much for every score of sheep, more for a score of cattle because they were heavier and did more damage to the roadbed, and so on and so forth. And in some states, Ohio being one of them, the wider the wheels on your wagon, the less you had to pay, because the more narrow wheels, of course, would bite in through the gravel and into the base of the road. Whereas if you had wider wheels, they actually helped because they acted as the rollers had been when they flattened the road as they were originally building it. So at least in Ohio, if your wheels were over 5 inches wide, you traveled for free because you were not causing damage to the road, you were actually helping it.
Okay, so with like the smaller wheels were what causing ruts,
Yes, yes,
akin
absolutely.
to potholes.
Yeah, except narrower and longer.
Yeah. Okay. So, this is the time of the year when the orange cones come out, and the crews are out there putting asphalt into the potholes. They need to put one on one of the roads I was on today. Tire off, but that's another story. But we're still dealing with the same issues today. So someone has to pay the crews to go out there and throw the gravel around 200 years ago, or pay the guys to put the orange cones up, and the guy to hold the stop sign and flag the traffic from the other direction on. So it costs money to do that. So we do have samples of places like Seawright's Toll House. What are they seem like very unusual buildings along the road. What were their functions other than to collect money for repairs?
Well, that pretty much was their sole function. They were
Was there a collector?
Yeah, there was a person who would collect the tolls.
Okay, the Seawright's place seems like it was big enough. Like, was he there 24/7? Like, was it his house, the collector's house? And
that is an outstanding question, and I do not know the answer. I would suspect, because I have seen the Seawright toll house. The ones in Pennsylvania were much nicer, I know, than the ones you found in other states. So it is possible that the toll collector did live in the Pennsylvania toll houses. I doubt if that was true in Maryland and Ohio.
Yeah, it's been a while since I was at Seawright's. I just forget. But those are some unique buildings for that period. I just fascinated by it. But there, I like for some of the people who were on the road, like the bigger wheels, they didn't have to pay. But there were the ingenious people who took advantage of the laws by saying, "Oh, I have to go to Grandpa's funeral or go to church," and
Right.
the same Grandpa was dying every week.
Yeah. People going to funerals, the people going to and from church didn't have to pay. I'll tell you, the folks that really came closest to getting away with murder were the stagecoach companies, because in most, if not all, the states, the toll collection laws said that any vehicle transporting U.S. mail didn't have to pay a toll. So stagecoach companies simply made sure that they tossed one mail bag on virtually every stage that went along the road. Now, the states caught on to this, and there were back and forth lawsuits and usually compromises. And what ended up happening usually was the stage company simply paid a flat fee, which was good for a whole year.
We were talking about price gouging with the flooding earlier this evening, and they were looking at how people try to get out of paying taxes. It's all the same same kind of thing going on, and then there's another story you had around Circleville where they kept having to move the exit because people were getting off a national road, and they were able to detour the exit or the toll booth.
Right. Yeah, that was in Centerville, Indiana, where they would take side streets. Their mistake was putting the toll booth in the community. If they would have put it a few miles east or west, there wouldn't have been any other options. But in Centerville, I think they moved the thing 3 or 4, maybe 5 times, and finally ended up putting it where it had been to begin with.
I thought it was just funny that how all this stuff just keeps the government catches on to how people are able to evade tax, and there's a government response, and then people make adjustments and still try to find ways around it. Nothing new under the sun.
No, that's one thing you learn if you study history, is that human nature doesn't change very much. We maybe sometimes get a little better controlling it, but it's still the basic animal.
Right. Okay, so let's see. Okay, we did touch on this a couple weeks ago when Brian J. Jones was a guest, but you did say that up until the 1850s, 9 presidents had traveled National Road, and 4 did on their way to be inaugurated.
That sounds about right. Now, of course, at least one of them, Abraham Lincoln, traveled it before he became president, when he was a member of the House of Representatives.
Yeah, so there it's on page 99. 9 U.S. presidents made one or more trips over the road, some many years before or after their time in the White House. 4 traveled it as part of their journeys to be inaugurated, and James Monroe was the first.
He wouldn't have gone there on the way to be inaugurated, but he was the first president to travel over the road.
To traverse the road.
Yeah, I misunderstood what you were saying there. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And interesting about Monroe, because this is when it was still being built, and he stopped in Wheeling, where they were having a terrible problem with the road slipping along Wheeling Hill, and he offered advice about putting up sidewalls to prevent the problem, which they ended up doing.
Okay, and we also get William Henry Harrison, James Polk, Zachary Taylor, John Quincy Adams, and Martin Van Buren, James Buchanan, and we when a couple weeks ago when Brian was our guest, he we spoke a little bit about Washington Irving's long-standing friendship with Martin Van Buren. So I thought your National Road book had some really nice tie-ins with Brian's biography of Washington Irving. It is that you and Brian do an amazing job of recreating that 1820s, 1830s, time period, and you, you get to know a little bit more about the, just day-to-day activities of some of these well-known figures from American history. Not everything is related to some passage of this political bill. They had to get from point A to point B somehow, and
and it would not be unusual for a prominent politician such as Henry Clay to be riding in the stagecoach with just a group of ordinary citizens.
And some of the presidents did travel in opulence. I just saw that too.
Again, really everybody did, because these stagecoach companies competed with each other, particularly the exterior paint jobs, to make those coaches as beautiful as they could. But that was the same for a president as it was for anybody else who might be riding the stage for whatever reason.
Wow. So Rod, we have probably like 40 minutes. I mean, I don't want to slight your fantastic book, McKinley Murder and the Pan-American Exposition. Is there anything else you want to say about your National Road book? I just really enjoyed that one too. I highly recommend it.
Well, one thing that you and I had talked about in the lead up to this, something that seemed interesting to you, was the express mail in 1836.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I don't want to forget that. And you get so let's talk about getting the mail to people from the East Coast out to the Midlands.
Well, and of course, by and large, the mail was transported by stagecoach. But in 1836, the Postmaster General, Andrew Jackson's Postmaster General, I believe his name was Amos Kendall, came up with an idea to transport mail much, much faster. And to people that are familiar with American history, when I start talking about this will ring some bells, I suspect. But the idea was to have boys, ages 15 and up, on a horse, and they would ride 5 to 7 miles in a circuit, and they would go 3 of those circuits west each day and 3 of those circuits back east. And for that, they were paid $6 a month in silver. And, of course, the mail that was transported this way was you couldn't send newspapers or anything like that, just letters with a very, very small ounce weight to them. But people started nicknaming it the Pony Express, and it was very much like the Pony Express that about 20 years later would go from, I believe it was St. Joseph's, Missouri to Sacramento, young boys riding as quickly as they could to get the mail through. And in both cases, it didn't make any money, so neither one was around for very long, close to a year. But there were some newspaper editors who were a little bit skeptical of this. but at one point, I would assume this would have been in 1837, for some reason, the president, what then was called the annual message, today it's the State of the Union address, newspapers were extremely anxious to be the first to get that in print. It was really a big deal, much more so than it is today. And at one point, the message made it from Washington, D.C. to Zanesville, Ohio in 27 hours. So that was a tribute to the efficiency of these boys, but unfortunately, as I said, it didn't make money, and that was what was important, and that's what did it in.
Okay. Just a little aspect of American history. A lot of people may not know about, but they can learn about it in your America's First Interstate.
Well, of course, everybody's heard of the Pony Express, but yeah, the original one has more or less been lost to history.
Yeah, it just those little tidbits of what it was like helps us to envision what life was like. So, okay, let's switch over to your McKinley book, and I think that one's really like three intertwined biographies of President McKinley, the 1901 Pan American Expo, and Leon Czolgosz. So, and we'll see how they all intertwine over the next 40 minutes or so. But here you are taking, the future president is a Ohio Valley native.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and you look at the more far-reaching impacts of what was going on at the world at the time, as well as his presidential assassination. But what was William McKinley's background? Just do a brief discussion of that, and how was he viewed by both parties, and things like that.
Well, McKinley was born in Niles, Ohio, which is not too far from Youngstown, a little bit west of Youngstown. I guess it has to be west if it's still going to be in Ohio. And later moved to Poland. In 1861, when he was 18 years old, Fort Sumter was fired upon, and like many young men, he joined the Union Army and entered as a private, unlike most of the other Civil War veterans who became president. They mostly went into the Army as high-ranking officers with a commission. He didn't. But at the Battle of Antietam, very bloody battle fought on September 17th, 1862, he was the brigade commissary officer. And there was very fierce fighting on his part of the battlefield. And he realized that some men in the thick of it hadn't had anything to eat for over 12 hours. So on his own, in fact, really going against orders, he loaded a bunch of food into a wagon, got a couple volunteers to go with him, and took that wagon straight through enemy fire. In fact, it was hit a couple of times. But that earned him promotion to an officer, and by the end of the war, he'd risen to the rank of major. He came back home to Ohio after the war. He had considered making the military his career, but his father was dead set against the idea. So his father really helped change history. But he moved to Canton, Ohio, and of course that's the city with which he's mainly associated, and was first elected. I believe his first office was prosecuting attorney for Stark County. But he rose up through the political ranks and was elected to Congress in 1876, and that's where his national political career, of course, really gets started.
Okay, and so William, works his way up through, politics, and we also have, the background going into this Pan-American Expo that needs explained. So what were some of the other issues going on? There was probably a lot more international stuff at the time. At 1901 or late 1890s into 1901, there was a lot of international political stuff that maybe a lot of people aren't that aware of. There's like the Maine battleship explosion in Philippines. So, Roger, can you give us a brief background on that as well?
Well, in 1898, and by this time McKinley was president. He was midway through his first term. Conditions in Cuba, which was a colony of Spain, became a major issue in the United States. Spain was very, very harsh with its colonists, and rumors that there might be a war between the United States and Spain started to percolate. President McKinley dispatched the Maine, I believe it was a battle class ship, I don't remember for sure, to Havana Harbor. Basically, he meant it to be a goodwill gesture. But while the ship was there was an explosion. A number of men was killed, and a Navy investigation concluded, wrongly it's believed now, that an external force, meaning a mine or something planted by the Spanish, had led to the explosion. So the pressure of war became overbearing. McKinley did not want to go to war. He said, I've seen war, I've seen the bodies piled up, and I don't want to see it again. But it reached the point that if he didn't ask for a declaration of war, Congress was going to vote one without his recommendation. So he finally, reluctantly, sent a war message, and the Spanish-American War lasted about 4 months. Of course, it made Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders famous. And when it was over, the United States had Cuba for a short time, but then granted it its independence, but kept as colonies Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And that was the world setting as folks in Buffalo, New York started to make plans for a World's Fair, the Pan American Exposition. And in fact, they began making their plans in the mid-1890s, and they had to be put on hold because of the war. Now, one of the ideas of this exposition was to showcase Western Hemisphere unity, which was a bit of a trick at this time because several Latin American nations were somewhat resentful of the United States going to war with Spain and taking colonies as a result.
Okay, so, and along with some, some of the North and South American fellowship that was going on despite the international problems was that you have Edison and Tesla showing up in Buffalo as well.
Well, Edison and Tesla and George Westinghouse was on Tesla's side. They had been involved in what was known as the War of the Standards, and sometimes when I start talking about this, I go on, so if I say too much, just shut me up. But Thomas Edison was an advocate of direct current, DC. The problem with DC was you could only transmit this low-voltage electricity for about 10 miles. Well, Tesla and Westinghouse believed in a new current, alternating current, AC, which could be stepped up with transformers to extremely high voltages and sent an unlimited distance. So it was much more practical. But Edison and some people who came to work with him, they tried to convince the public that this AC was just remarkably dangerous. If it came into your home, it would blow it up, which it could if it wasn't stepped back down. That's why there are transformers on utility poles all around everybody's hometown today. But it became a vicious thing. A friend of Edison's by the name of Harold Brown held these events where he would kill dogs with alternating current. Just to try to prove this point. But in the end, the practicality of AC won out, and one of the big power plants first big power plant for generating the AC current was, logically enough, at Niagara Falls, which is only a few miles from Buffalo. So one of the aims of this World's Fair, this Pan American Exposition, was to showcase electricity. This event was going to have 400 miles of electrical wire. They purchased 200,000 incandescent bulbs from General Electric, and they'd end up with a light bill that, and this was in 1901 dollars, ended up costing them $25,000 a month during the run of the exposition.
Okay. Seems pretty expensive. So with bills like that, you need to get people interested in attending this event. So here we are back to what's supposed to start in April, and there's a heavy snow that delayed paving, bad weather in May and June. So it's not getting off to a good start.
No, and it never recovered. Now, that was not unique for the Pan-Am, though. There was a spate of these World's Fairs beginning in the late 1800s and continuing well into the 20th century. Probably the most famous is the World's Colombian Exposition in Chicago, partly because there's an excellent book about a serial killer that haunted it called Devil in the White City. But it and almost all of them lost money, but yeah, holding this in Buffalo really worked against them because, yeah, that snowfall was about 2 weeks before the thing was supposed to open, and they were already behind with their construction schedule, and suddenly you wake up one morning to 8 inches of wet snow, and that certainly didn't help.
Yeah, the third part of your intertwined biography is this sketchy character who had become the presidential assassin. What was his background? And you got to read some special notes on him while you were doing your research?
Yes, they were called alienists back then. They're called psychologists today. A man by the name of Channing interviewed a number of Czolgosz's family members, friends, contemporaries. I don't know that Czolgosz and his motives will ever be fully understood, but he was born in June of 1873. Either, I forget now, his parents were immigrating from Poland, and he was either born when the ship was on its way here or very, very shortly after he arrived. Certainly the United States was the only country he ever knew. Probably the best description of him was one that a friend gave, calling him a dreamer, always a dreamer. He bounced around through a series of jobs, mostly in manufacturing. And then when he was in his early 20s, his father, who really achieved the American dream, he was able to purchase a farm not too far from Cleveland. But by then, Czolgosz, who had been an industrious young fella, just suddenly changed. Part of it was his mother had died, and he absolutely hated his stepmother, and the feeling was mutual. And he basically withdrew into a world of his own, took his meals in his bedroom, went off by himself, and really became a distant individual, even from his own family.
Yeah. In a couple weeks, next the 10th, I have Mark Olshaker as a guest, and we're probably going to get into a little bit of his the profiling book he did on Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. But here's another example of where this would-be presidential assassin seems like almost to be characterized by the Unabomber manifesto. Just kind of like being having a hatred for industrialization and hates technology, that kind of stuff.
That happened with Czolgosz. It began when he became disillusioned with his Roman Catholic faith. And then, of course, anarchism was a large political movement at that time. I say large, the numbers were really small, but there was a number of assassinations in Europe, and Czolgosz began to adopt this philosophy. Now, he's often just simply dismissed as an anarchist assassin, and there's a little bit of nuance to it. In May of 1901, he attended a lecture in Cleveland that was given by Emma Goldman, who was a noted anarchist leader at the time, and he seems to have become infatuated by her. One of the law enforcement officials, I don't remember if it was City of Buffalo or Erie County, which includes Buffalo, but he talked to Czolgosz and was completely convinced that he was in love with her. So another possible theory is, like John Hinckley wanting to impress Jodie Foster by killing Ronald Reagan, that romance may have been part of Czolgosz's motive.
You do a great job of getting those details in there and showing something that it I'm sure a lot of the listeners are remember the Jodie Foster connection to or not the Hinckley thing with Jodie Foster and this like indoctrination type situation. It just seems like there was just you can see some of the stuff going on today that could almost be applicable to 120 years ago.
Yeah, again, human nature does not change.
Right. So, okay, so we'll come back to Leon here in a minute. But before we move on, he got more involved in the disillusionment of the prosperity that industrialization was to bring with that homestead strike, where there was several dozen picketers that were shot in Pittsburgh.
Yes.
So it's kind of add a little bit more fuel to the fire. You can see like the slow dismantling of a personality with him. But we'll go into more detail with Mark in about 10 days. But anyhow, in your book you have a lot of photos of these buildings that were being built for the expo. I mean, this is these aren't just like little tents that were put up for like a weekend festival. These are some pretty substantial buildings.
Well,
you get the electric tower.
In truth, they look substantial, but they were not made to stand the test of time. The idea was that virtually every one would be taken down right after the exposition. So they were, of course, built to be safe and built to house people and the exhibits that were in them. But they were not built to last, with one exception. The New York State Building was designed to be permanent. And in fact, that's where the Buffalo, New York, Erie County Historical Society is located now, and that's where I ended up doing quite a bit of research, because they have all the exposition records.
Okay, well, yeah, and a Grand Canal was built alongside the horticultural building, and you have a Temple of Music. Sprawling machinery building. Sprawling is you used the correct adjective there. You have quite a few photos of these buildings. It must have really been something to see.
It would have been amazing, because, as you say, those buildings were very, very impressive looking if you didn't really examine them really closely, and they were all outlined with these electrical lights, which were about the wattage and size of the old-fashioned outside Christmas lights that people my age might remember from the 60s, bigger than a lot of the Christmas lights that are used today. But they made what had to be an extremely impressive display.
Okay. And since we were talking about time travel at the beginning of the show this is to make up for Tuesday's botched show. Make a connection there is Scott Paper had a contract for supplying toilet paper. I mean, this is like names that we're familiar with today.
Right, yeah. Aunt Jemima Pancakes introduced a new type of flour at the fair. Instant coffee was introduced, and there are others that I can't pull up right now. But this was definitely meant to be a celebration of American technology, American achievement, highlighted with what could be done with electricity.
Yeah, and there's also electric typewriters that were presented for like the first. Yeah. Gramophones.
Right. Which, for people that don't know, they were what we would today call a record player.
There's let's see, what Buffalo Bill was there, Geronimo.
Calamity Jane.
Yeah, Calamity Jane. So you get all these
John
names.
Philip Sousa and his band, they got $30,000 for, I believe, a 3 or 4 week contract.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, Civil War swords were on display. All
that
the
was
U.S.
in the government
coins.
building.
Yeah, all the U.S. coins that were ever minted were put on display. All kinds of native artifacts. So there were, both American hemispheres were, well represented. Incan mummies. There's the medicinal use of cocaine. Okay, so as I don't really have 10 minutes. But okay, you also get boa constrictors. So this is.
Yeah, that was from Frank Bostock's Wild Animal Show.
Yeah, so somehow, with all these, snakes escaping and bad weather, it looks like, there is some education of what all these different continents offer, and there was something remarkable about North and South America could work together. So, there are a few little problems, but overall, it's there's a lot of good intent there. good things seem to be happening. But okay, let's get to Leon's further slide into his dark mental condition, and the President McKinley's arrival to the Expo.
Right. Well, one of the sad ironies of this is that McKinley was supposed to be at the Exposition several months earlier than he was, but his wife, who had a number of problems, I would probably say both mental and physical, she had become very ill when he was on a trip to San Francisco to dedicate the battleship Ohio. So because of her condition, he delayed his arrival at the Exposition. And, of course, it was in between these times that Czolgosz really became interested in anarchy. And so if McKinley would have arrived at the Exposition when he was originally scheduled to, this assassination very likely would not have happened. But as it turned out, Czolgosz went to Buffalo a few weeks before the scheduled President's Day, as they called it. And while he was there, he purchased a .32 caliber Iver Johnson revolver. And although his plans were never really definite, he sort of just went with the flow of events. Murder began to enter, as you describe it, his troubled mind.
Okay, so how did he get so close to the president?
Well, of course, you have to remember this was 1901, and things were very, very different at that time. The Secret Service in 1901 only provided presidential protection when the president went on the road. When he was in Washington at the White House, he was the responsibility of the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department. But at Buffalo, McKinley did have a three-man Secret Service detail. Plus, there were Exposition police. There was the 73rd Seacoast Artillery, which also provided some security. But McKinley, on the day of the assassination, first went on a tour of Niagara Falls, and then he returned for a reception. You mentioned the Temple of Music, and that's the building where it was to take place. His secretary, George Cortelyou, was scared to death about this event. It was going to be a public reception line, handshaking, with people just simply filing through to shake hands with the president. And Leon Czolgosz entered that line. Now, it was an extremely hot day, and a number of people had handkerchiefs out to dust their brows of sweat. Well, Czolgosz did too, and he used his handkerchief to conceal his revolver. Now, as this line went through, as luck would have it, the man immediately ahead of Czolgosz looked Italian. And I'm certainly not justifying or defending this, but in these days of anarchy coming from Europe, the Secret Service agents looked him over quickly, and in fact, they grabbed him and passed him out. Czolgosz, being Polish, was white, to them innocent looking, and they didn't pay him much attention. So as Czolgosz approached the president, he had the revolver with the handkerchief covering it in his right hand. He extended his left hand, and McKinley just assumed that there was something wrong with the right hand, so he reached out to grab his left hand, and that's when Czolgosz fired two shots, and of course, one of them would eventually prove to be fatal.
Okay, so unfortunately, we only have like two 2 minutes left, but
All right.
yeah, what with all the electricity that was being showcased, there was not an X-ray machine that might have been able to help. It was actually a gynecologist that was on staff that was supposed to do the bullet removal.
It was a gynecologist, Dr. Matthew Mann, who did the surgery. Buffalo's most skilled surgeon, a man by the name of Roswell Park, was not available. He was in Niagara Falls, New York, tending to another patient. Had he been there, the outcome may have been different. We can't say that for sure. But just a few weeks earlier, Park had saved a woman who had a very, very similar gunshot wound to McKinley's.
And yeah, there wasn't an Edison did offer an X-ray machine, but that was turned down. It just seemed like something that had so much promise of bringing people together ended up in tragedy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a Shakespearean tale, no doubt about it.
Well, I think we're down to a few seconds.
Okay.
Roger, what's the best way people can get your books?
Well, I would assume, the same way everybody gets everything anymore, Amazon.
Okay.
But they can, the National Road book, they could go to the Kent State University Press website. The McKinley book was published by an outfit named McFarland. And unfortunately, the 36 Blood was self-published, so that would probably be a little bit more difficult get.
Okay. Well, you also have your Johnson's Island and other Civil War books on Amazon as well. And Roger,
Yeah.
I just want to thank you for being a fantastic guest. I really enjoy having you on my shows, and hopefully we will be able to get together soon again, and we will see everyone, or I'll see everyone on the 10th. Thank you again,